Now that you know how to write a quadratic function in vertex form, let's talk about, well, what do you do if they ask you to put it in factored form? Or you might also see this called intercept form, okay? Well, just like before, in order to write it in this form, you're going to have to remember what that form is. So factored form or intercept form is y equals, you're still going to have that number up front. And then this one is kind of broke up into its factors. So this is going to have like x minus a number, and that's going to be kind of like one of your factors. And so this is written different ways depending on where you look. Sometimes I think they put the letter P here, or you might see it as like an x1. That actually represents, remember, these are your x-intercepts, so that would be one place that the parabola crosses the x-axis. And then it's going to be x minus the other x-intercept. And so when you have to put it in this form, you're going to have to, kind of like what we did up here where we had to find these three numbers. To be able to put it in factored form, you're going to have to find the a, you're going to have to find one of your x-intercepts, and then you're going to have to find the other one. And so really, to put it in factored form, you kind of have to have 3 points. You have to have both of the x-intercepts. So to be able to put it in this form, you have to know the x-intercepts, where it crosses the x-axis. But then you also, kind of like you did up in this problem up here, you also have to have a coordinate that it goes through just so that you can find that number up front. And so this process that we use for putting it in factored form will be similar to what we did with the vertex form example, but we're kind of plugging it in a different equation. So that part will look a little bit different. So to be able to put it in factored form, you need the x-intercepts, and you need a point that it goes through. So you need another point on the parabola. So let's do an example with this one. Okay. This problem says write a quadratic function in factored form given the following graph. Okay, and they don't always have to give you a graph. Sometimes they might just give you information and you can go from there. Sometimes it helps to graph it to kind of see what's going on. But sometimes they give you a graph. So if they give you a graph, you just pull your information. So if we're putting it in factored form, remember, we have to have the x-intercepts, so we're going to be looking for those first, and then we're going to look for another point that it goes through so that we can plug it in to help us find that number that goes up front. And then once we find all of those, we can just plug it into this equation, just how it looks, and then we'll have the factored form of that parabola. Okay, so I'm going to look at my graph. I'm going to first try to find my x-intercepts. And so let's see if we can figure out where it crosses the x-axis. So when I look at my u, I look at my x-axis and I notice that it crosses right here, and then it also crosses right there. So both of those would be my x-intercepts. So one of my x-intercepts is at -1, and then the other x-intercept is at 2. Okay, so there's those two pieces of information. So that's actually what's going to be plugged in here and here. Then I also have to know another point that the parabola goes through. So just like I talked about up here, it can be any point that it goes through. It doesn't have to be necessarily the point they pick out for you. But if they do pick it out for you, they're probably wanting you to use that one particularly. Okay, but it could really be any good point that's on your graph that you could use. Okay, so they do point out this one for me, and I can see that it does, the U shape does go through that point, so I'm going to use that point. So the point that I'm going to use to help me write my equation would be 0, -4. Okay, so once you find your information, now you're going to use it to help you find your missing information or your missing part of your puzzle. So notice we have this one and this one, like those are your x-intercepts, so we know those. So this would be like your kind of where you're going to put plug in for the x1, and then this would be your other one. So you're going to plug that in for your x2, okay? But what you don't know right now is the number that would go up front. So that's actually what we're looking for. And so to find that, that's where this point comes from, or that's where this point comes in. Is you're going to use this kind of like you did up here, and to plug in for your x and y to be able to find a, okay? So everywhere I see an x, I'm going to plug in the x value. So my x value that I'm plugging in is my 0. And then for my y, I'm going to plug in the y value here, okay? So just like you did before, you copy your equation down. So I'm going to just copy it down. So there's my factored form that I'm going to be plugging in for. And then all I have to do is plug in my information. So it does help to label it so you know where you're putting it. So my y value is going to be my -4. I'm looking for a. That's the whole reason we do this, is to find a. Then, okay, well, my x value. So this is the x value from the point that you've picked. So that would be 0. So everywhere I have an x, I'm plugging in a 0. And then it's 0 minus my x-intercept. So my x-intercept, one of them was -1. So notice you put this minus that number. And then for the other one, it would be, there's my x value again. So you have to actually plug into your 0 again, minus my other x-intercept, which would be 2. Okay, so now it's just a matter of simplifying and then solving for a. So my -4 comes down. My a is going to have to come down, and all of this is being multiplied. So do the parentheses first, and then you multiply them. So let's see, 0 minus a negative. Well, minus a negative is going to become a positive, so it'd be like 0 plus 1. So that gives me 1. And then in this one, I have 0 minus 2, which 0 minus 2 is -2. And then we multiply them. So when I have 1 times -2, that gives me -2. And because this is being multiplied times that, like I talked about in the last problem, we typically put it in front of the variable. And then we have to finish solving. So to finish solving, well, I'm multiplying the a times -2. So I'm going to divide by -2. And then my a, I'm going to switch over here. Comes down because that's 1. And then -4 over -2 is 2. So, again, all of this side work we use to help us find a. So once we find a, now, like I said before, we have all of our information to be able to write that equation. So now I just have to plug it in, and I'll have my equation in factored form. Okay, so I'm going to take it. I'm going to plug in piece by piece. So I found my a. My a was 2, so that's the number that goes up front. And then it's x minus whatever my first x-intercept is. So it'd be x minus, my first x-intercept was -1. And so we'll have to probably simplify that in a second, just a little bit. And then it's going to be x minus, and then I put my other x-intercept, which would be 2. Okay, so the only thing that I have to do to kind of simplify this just a bit is, remember, when we subtract a negative number, that's the same thing as adding. And so we just have to change that. And that would be our factored form of that parabola.